We're in our series on the prophet Elijah. We started this series last week, and if you remember, last week we talked about Elijah on Mount Carmel and this encounter that he had with the prophets of Baal and the forces that were aligned against the worship of God in Israel. And it's this huge triumph, right? Elijah has this sacrifice that he puts out at God's command, and the fire from heaven comes down and consumes it, and the prophets of Baal are they're killed, and then the people of Israel are being brought back to the worship of the one true God. So it seems like this amazing moment, and it seems like everything is finally falling into place for Elijah, because here he is. I mean, he just had this huge triumph, but something happens. And in chapter 19, we read about Jezebel, who is King Ahab's wife. She's Queen Jezebel. She hears what has happened, and she sent a messenger to Elijah to put him on notice. Verse 2, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them," that is, like one of the prophets of Baal that were killed. "If I don't make your life like one of them," which is to say, dead, which is to say, "I'm going to get you, Elijah. You are dead meat." And Jezebel puts out this message, and Elijah runs for it. Verse 3, "Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Then he came to Beersheba in Judah, and he left his servant there." Elijah runs for it. He runs for his life. Why? Because you would think that Elijah would be on top of the world, right? I mean, he just experienced fire from heaven. The Lord was with him. What more was there to be afraid of? But Elijah is like all of us. And he may have had this powerful moment of success, this moment when it seemed like everything was turning around and going God's way and his way, when all is going to plan. God's good, the rest is just details. And then bang, it all falls apart. And Elijah learns, just like all of us need to learn, that he needs God's nourishment for the journey. He needs God's nourishment for the journey, which we all need. And you see, there's more going on here in this passage than just Elijah running for his life. He's not just running blind. Elijah's on a journey. I mean, look where Elijah goes. If you've got your scriptures, we'll walk right through this. He travels south. There's two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel to the north, the kingdom of Judah to the south. He travels south into the southern kingdom, which is away from the authority of Jezebel. He goes into the land of Judah, and it says that he leaves his servant in Beersheba in Judah. Beersheba is this city, and then he goes off a day's journey. Verse 4 goes off a day's journey into the desert. He's going alone. And this is very important because what Elijah is doing, he's not just running from a brutal queen. Elijah is seeking God. He's going out into the desert just like Moses did long ago. He's entering into his own little exile like the people of Israel once had. And at the moment of Elijah's deepest despair, he is turning and he's seeking God. And this is the thing. You know, often when we're not sure what to do or where to turn, we can start to take comfort in distractions. We can fill our lives up with stuff, often on a screen. But not Elijah. Elijah knows that if he's going to find God, then he's got to get to this spacious place, this place where there are no distractions, where it's just him and God. And so Elijah starts to strip off the distractions. He leaves his people, right? He goes south out of Israel. He leaves his country. He gets to Beersheba. He leaves his servant. And then he leaves civilization and goes into the desert. Because he knows that's where he's got to meet God, in the desert, alone. So that's where he goes. In verse 4, he goes a day's journey. He comes to a broom tree, sat down under it, prayed that he might die. He says, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." And you know, this is really Elijah's lowest moment. I mean, he's ready to give up. He's ready to die. He's just like, "Take my life, Lord." Just let me die. I don't have anything more to offer you. I am so useless to you, God. I've had enough. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors, which is really just to say, I've had it up to here. I'm fed up. I've failed. I'm just like my ancestors before me. And he lays down under this broom tree, finds a bit of shade in the desert, and that's where he stays. Now, have you ever been to this place? You ever had a broom tree moment? Elijah lays down under the broom tree and he's ready to die. He's ready to give up. He's really lost not so much his faith in God, that's still there, but he's lost his faith in himself. Right? He went out into the desert to find God, so he believes in God. And here he is praying in God and he's waiting on the Lord. So he hasn't given up on God, but Elijah has given up on himself. He feels like he doesn't have anything more to give, and he doesn't know what to do next. So he lays down under the broom tree, right? He can't fix Israel. He has no plan, no strategy. He's worn out. He's had enough, and he's ready to die, and he's no better than anybody else. So he just says, Lord, take my life. And he lays down under that broom tree. I mean, have you ever been there, right? A broom tree moment. Because this is the original broom tree moment right here. It's what happens when you get to this place and you realize that you don't have what it takes to carry on. And I think this especially is what happens when we realize that we don't have what it takes to do God's will. Right? Where we feel like God is calling us to something and we can't do it. And it'd be easy to label Elijah this old complainer, but it really takes a special kind of humility to recognize that we're at our wits' end and can't go any further, that our strength is not enough. And that's what Elijah does. He just stops. Have you ever been there? Have you ever sat down or collapsed or sunk or fallen down under that broom tree? I mean, have you ever just been to this place where you say, I don't have it in me to continue forward? I mean, I've been there more than once. It's this moment where you say, what am I supposed to do, Lord? And honestly, anything that's worth doing has the risk of plunking us right down under that broom tree. Anything that's big and challenging and worth risking our neck and sticking our neck out there is going to mean that you might end up under the broom tree at some point, where the situation requires more than what you can give. I read a book recently about a young man named J.D. Vance, and tells about how he grew up in this violent, poverty-stricken hillbilly culture in Kentucky and Ohio. But J.D., unlike some of his classmates, was able to make it out of this culture, and he ended up, his pathway took him through the Marines, took him to college, and then through Yale Law School. And he talks about how, in contrast to the life that he had growing up, he found himself training with these Marines, and he thought, he thought he was in pretty good shape. He was getting kind of strong. He was getting in good physical shape, and he could really, he could run like they were asking him to do. And so one day he says, I was jogging in, and all the troops are jogging in, and one of the drill sergeants looks at him and goes, run faster. If you're not feeling like you're going to puke, you're not running fast enough. He had to push himself. He had to give it his all. The message was, go big or go home. Now, it's sort of like that with our walk with God, less the puking part. But if you don't find yourself under the broom tree from time to time, if you don't find yourself at that place where you have pushed your limits and gone beyond what is humanly possible and depended completely on God's strength, then it's probably because we're not trying. If we don't find ourselves at that place where we are beyond our normal limits, it's probably because we're not taking any risks for God. It's probably because we're staying within our comfort zones. We're not staking anything on God. We're just kind of like JD, jogging along, feeling pretty good, feeling pretty comfortable. And I've been there. I'm there way too often. Because you see, any time that we start to walk in God's way, there's this risk that we're going to lose our way, that we're going to wind up in the desert and we're going to say, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't know what to do next. I mean, this is the stuff that midlife crises are made of, and we turn 40 or whatever the age is for you. We turn 40 and we look around and think, wait a minute, wasn't I told that I was full of potential? Wasn't I supposed to change the world by now? And I've got just a couple of months here to catch up to my wife and get my world changing in before I hit 40. But, we get to that moment where I thought that I was going to change the world, and here I am, and what is the center of the meaning of my life? The prophet Jeremiah faced this same moment, this broom tree moment, a kind of discouragement where many, many years after the ministry of Elijah, Jeremiah is prophesying while the city of Jerusalem is under siege by the Babylonians, and the king is against Jeremiah, and the people were turning to other gods, and Jeremiah says he didn't even want to talk about God anymore. Jeremiah just wants to get on with his life. He's like, why was I even born? This is terrible. He just wants to be left alone. And then in Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 9, Jeremiah says, I can't stop. If I say I'll never mention the Lord or speak in his name, his words burn in my heart like a fire. He says, it's like a fire in my bones. I'm weary of holding it in. That was Jeremiah's broom tree moment, that moment when he was ready to lay it all down. He was ready to just quit talking about God. Even Jesus had a broom tree moment. Do you remember that time when Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane? And he knows that he's just got another day on earth and in his earthly life. And he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he leaves his disciples behind a little ways, and he goes to God and just pours his heart out. He says, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not what I want, but what you want. Do you remember that? It was this moment when Jesus kind of could have gone either way. He could have dumped his whole mission. That was the temptation. Or he could follow through on God's will. It was his broom tree moment. Like Elijah, he gets to this place where he has to set it all aside and pray to God. Now, there are a few things that we can do when we find ourselves at this moment. We can give up. We can just kind of throw our hands in the air and just forget about the whole thing. I mean, that's what a lot of people do when they experience some kind of disappointment in their life, especially when it's disappointment with God or disappointment with the church. They just give up. Toss the whole thing. Forget about it. Or we can try to kind of power through, just lean on our own smarts or on our youth or our strength or caffeine. And all of those wells eventually run dry. And usually this just reveals our own Messiah complex. And I think a lot of the time the reason that God lets us get to this point out in the desert is because if we don't take our turn sleeping under the broom tree, we'll never shed our false selves, our false hopes, our false belief in our own ability to fix the world. There's one other possibility. We can turn to God's strength. And I happen to think that in spite of all appearances, that is exactly what Elijah does. He turns to God's strength. Because look where Elijah is at in this passage. He could have gone anywhere. He could have gone into the city of Beersheba. It's in Judah, safe from the power of Jezebel. He could have just stayed with his servant, gotten a job, settled down, lived a quiet life. But instead, Elijah goes out into the desert looking for God. Elijah didn't know where his strength was going to come from next, so he placed himself in a position where he could find God. And it's exactly in this place of despair and weakness that God meets him. Look at verse 5, the second part. He lays down. All at once, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." And this is key. God gives Elijah a word, and God gives him encouragement. Now, the word is very simple. This word that God gives Elijah, I don't know if you caught it. It's very simple. God just says to Elijah, "Get up." kind of like maybe some of your parents say to you on a school day. Get up. And that might not sound like much, but I think it's actually an encouraging word. Get up. God's telling Elijah, don't give up. Don't lay down your mission. Do not lose heart. Get up. God's saying that there's this part that Elijah's got to do, and there's this part that God is going to do, but Elijah's got to follow through on his part. Get up. God is saying, I'm not done with you yet. Get up. And there's a second part. This is the encouragement. God says, and eat. Get up and eat. And it's not just God telling Elijah to work harder or do more or be strong. It's God saying, eat. I'm here for you. I'm nourishing you. I'm going to give you what you need to continue. Get up and eat. And there it is, right there at Elijah's head, the bread and the water. Now it's interesting because this is not Elijah's first time being fed by God. There was that time when he was at the Wadi Kerith and the ravens brought him the bread. That was not normal. That was something supernatural. The ravens showed up with bread. We wouldn't have expected that. There was that time when he met the widow at Zarephath and she gave him her last bread. We wouldn't have expected that. I mean, she had said, I'm going to just make these final little loaves of bread and then my son and I are going to die. And here is Elijah again in the desert. No ravens, no widows or bakeries in sight. And it's an angel who brings him his bread. Get up and eat. It's the moment when God's abundance meets Elijah's weakness. Get up and eat. And I wonder if we can just say that together. Get up and eat. God doesn't leave Elijah under that broom tree. God gives him the nourishment that he needs to go forward. Get up and eat. Now think about this with me. Think about a time when you have been there. When God has given you what you need to go on. And I know that you must have had a time like this, that this must have happened because you're here. You're in church. And think about a time that was hard, but that God was there for you. That time, think about that diagnosis, or that news, or that move that you had to make, or that place where God met you. Get up and eat. A dear friend of ours tells the story of her time serving in Egypt, and she had a friend who was a nun named Sister Mary, and Mary cared for 30 young girls at an orphanage in Cairo. And by Mary's calculations, it took 2 kilograms of rice to feed those girls each day. But one night as she was preparing the rice, she noticed that she didn't have enough. It ran short. As Sister Mary began to prepare the meal, she found that she only had 1 kilogram. Now, our friend recounts the story like this. Sister Mary said this: I started with the little girls like usual. I didn't want to short them their needed calories. Then I honestly forgot that I didn't have enough and just started dishing rice out for everyone in earnest. Finally, the rice ran out, and I called out, "Who still needs rice?" Silence. Every girl had filled a plate, including me. God didn't give us mountains of rice, and he didn't give us bundles of money, but he gave us enough. It may seem little to you, but to me, this 1 kilo of rice was very big. God gave us just enough. And I don't know how this always works out, but I believe it. I've seen it. I've experienced it. I've lived through moments when there has been just enough. And Elijah said that he'd had enough of trouble, but now he's had enough of God because God has nourished him. Get up and eat. Have you been to that place? Have you been there? Do you need that now? Because it turns out that one of the key places that we meet God and his power and provision, it turns out that one of the key places is here. It's at God's table. I mean, that's where he feeds us. That's where he gives us the bread of life. That's where we meet Jesus in bread and cup. And like Elijah, we have to come often to the table, and we've got to find our sustenance in God. That angel came to him a second time, verse 7. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." Without God's nourishment, God's bread, that journey will be too long, too much for us. And this is the thing. We need God's nourishment for the journey. We'll never be able to live into what God is calling us to without his nourishment. We'll never be able to find our way without his bread. We'll never be able to continue the journey without the strength that God gives us. And Elijah knows this, and he gets this. Verse 8. He got up, ate, and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So 40 days and 40 nights, kind of like the Israelites were in the wilderness 40 years, like Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. God gives Elijah the strength he needs to go to Horeb. Now, where's Horeb? What's Horeb? A little bit of a mystery here, because Horeb is a sacred place. It's the mountain of God. It's called that here. Horeb is where Moses encountered God in this burning bush. Horeb is where God gave Moses a mission to go into Egypt and free his people. The other name for Horeb is Sinai, the place where Moses went up the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments. Horeb is the mountain where God made a covenant with his people. I'll be your God, you'll be my people. So Horeb is a pretty special place. It's the place of encounter. It's this place where God meets his people. It's where we hear from God. And so God gives Elijah the strength to continue his journey through the desert and meet him. It's not about just God giving him strength to continue whatever journey Elijah wants to take on, his own mission. It's about God giving him the strength to come to him. God sends us out and draws us in. Listen, any mission, any work that's worth doing is always going to be grounded in God and always going to point us back toward God. Any journey worth taking ends at Horeb, the place of meeting God. We've always got to ask ourselves, I think, are we just running or are we running toward Horeb? Because if we're running towards Horeb, toward this desert where we meet God, then it won't matter if we stumble along the way or if we get sidetracked in the desert. At least we're running in the right direction. But if we're just running, well, any hamster on a wheel can do that. It's on Mount Horeb that Elijah goes into that cave, just like Moses was in the cleft of a rock up on the mountain when God met him. And we're going to look at this section next week. Here's a little teaser. We're going to look at this next week, but in a nutshell, Elijah lays out his complaint. He says the Israelites haven't been faithful. They haven't worshiped God. They aren't keeping the covenant. They aren't following the prophets. In fact, they're killing them. It's Elijah against the world, or so it seems. And Elijah comes to this place where he meets God and can speak to God. He can just lay it all out before him, all of his problems and complaints. What are you going to do about this, God? But you know what? This is progress. Because at least he's standing before God again. So where are you at on your journey? Where do you need God's strength? Is it a relationship? Somebody that you care about? Is it a life choice? It doesn't even have to be momentous. It could just be the question of waking up each day and believing that you matter to God, that God made you with purpose, that God made you live for him, which is sometimes the hardest thing to wrap our minds around. Sometimes the hardest thing is just waking up and saying, I'm still here and I'm going to keep on walking. Where are you at on your journey? Where do you need strength? Because I'm convinced that God gives us everything we need to walk the way to him. Get up and eat. Amen.